This is roll 20. Roll 20 recorded February 5. Okay, Mr. Kim, rolling. This is roll 20, take 1.
Take it from the point we ended up.
Quite often, either one side or the other would try to overrun the position. They only had to go 15 or 20 feet, and that's when the actual hand-to-hand fighting would take place. But it wasn't with bayonets. They very rarely used bayonets. Sometimes they'd use a bayonet as a knife, but usually the Cambodian soldiers in particular would club their opponents with their rifle, then maybe turn it on them and shoot them. Of course, the Khmer Rouge, the communists, were trying to do the same thing. Hand grenades would be thrown at the same time, so it was a pretty wild melee for a few minutes. Usually only lasted 2 or 3 minutes because one side or the other was by that stage defeated. Anyway, okay. Rolling. This is roll 20, take 2. There were very rarely any surrenders. Almost no soldiers surrendered. They fought to the last man in Cambodia particularly. That was a facet of the Cambodian fighting. Never were there many, many prisoners, just occasionally. Usually when a Cambodian unit, whether it was communist or Cambodian government unit, was overrun, it meant they fought to the last man. It meant they died to the last man.
You tell a very good story, but so rarely does your film come up to what your story is like. Why?
The film very rarely comes up to expectations. Naturally, when you're there, involved in that fighting, you have to take care of yourself. You want to stay alive to continue to tell the story. And the cameraman or the correspondent who's in that frontline position is also trying to stay alive. So I never was able to film actual hand-to-hand fighting. Plenty of grenade throwing, plenty at 15 feet, but never hand-to-hand. I was ducking and dodging and keeping right out of the way of bullets flying in every direction. Once I was shot in the side in just that situation, and I wasn't trying to film, I was just trying to duck out of the way.
Is there any footage that you've missed and you'd kick yourself because you missed it, but it would have been great if you had had it?
Many, many, many times I've missed footage which I would have loved to have had, and I think in retrospect I could have obtained. But in retrospect also, if I'd have tried on other occasions, I would almost certainly have been killed, so maybe it balances out.
So you really can't make your news footage as good as Hollywood can make it?
Thank you, Steve. Rolling. This is roll 20, take 3. In Hollywood, of course, they can get to do it. And quite often it's a fair recreation of a battle scene. But in the real thing, you get one chance, and that's usually not enough. There are no retakes in the real thing.
Have you ever been put in a position where you've had to defend yourself with a gun?
There are many positions I've been in where it would have been preferable for me to defend myself with a rifle or any sort of weapon. But remember that I was always carrying a camera, at least in one hand, and quite often a tape recorder or something in another, or just using the spare hand for leverage or to fend off something. So I was only ever twice put in a position where I had to use a weapon.
What, you fired some shots?
I fired some shots on one occasion, yes.
What was the situation?
The situation was in Cambodia, and our position was being overrun by the communists. At least 1/3 of the defending troops were killed. Many, many more were seriously wounded. And 4 or 5 Cambodian soldiers and myself were cut off. There was no way but to pick up a weapon and help defend the position, which we fortunately did successfully, or, to be more exact, it enabled us to escape.
How long were you trapped there for?
I was trapped there in a very, very bad position for only minutes. The escape took 2 or 3 days.
Did that noise come across?
No.
Can you tell me what sort of moral question that posed to you at the time? Or did it pose a moral question?
I always thought that such a situation would pose a moral question. In actual fact, there was no moral question in my mind. It was either be killed or defend myself. I chose to defend myself.
How do you feel as a cameraman and a non-combatant being put in that situation? I mean, if you weren't in a war zone, you wouldn't be putting yourself at a point where you could have to take human life.
It was something that I knew I'd have to face at some time or other. But I always do remind myself that I was in that position where I could have defended myself several thousand times. I did on only 2 occasions. I thought that was a pretty fair record. Only as a last resort. Quite often there would be hand-to-hand fighting going on around me, and I didn't resort to defending myself in this way. If it would have been necessary, if I had been directly attacked, of course I would have. I was shot at many, many times in that situation. All I did was duck. This is roll 20, take 4. I think I can go in. Okay, this is roll 20, take 4. For example, my editor would sometimes send me a telegram asking why I didn't have film of the troops firing their weapons, when obviously I'd been in a very big battle. I'd said it was a big battle, and the sound that I'd sent along with the film corroborated that. Well, the answer was very simple. When the troops I was with were under heavy fire, they were keeping their heads down. Soldiers in another part of the battlefield would be engaging the enemy. So it was impossible for me to get those shots of the soldiers fighting. Sorry, we got a fucking... This is roll 20, take 4 again. For example, my editor in London would sometimes send me a telegram asking why I didn't have film of soldiers firing their weapons. Well, the answer was simple. We'd been in a very heavy firefight, so heavy that the soldiers that I was with had to keep their heads down all the time. Their colleagues in the other part of the battlefield were returning the fire. I always refused, categorically refused, to take film after the battle of soldiers firing their weapons. It wasn't historically correct. I wasn't going to take film of them firing for firing's sake. After all, they might kill, seems a silly thing to say, but they might kill somebody on the other side simply because I had asked them to fire their weapons. And they weren't firing them in the course of the battle. So that's why sometimes I didn't have that sort of film, but I was satisfied with the coverage because it was historically correct.
Would some other networks get the guys to stage it?
Well, it was a common thing, especially early in the war, for almost all networks to stage that sort of thing. They'd have the same experience that I'd had. Then they would get the soldiers to fire their weapons afterwards. Later on, the American networks ceased doing that. They stopped doing it. But early in the war, no, they all did it. This is roll 20, take 5. I'll go on with it. Early in 1973, when President Nixon announced a ceasefire in Indo China, I was in Cambodia, and there was no ceasefire there. I was besieged in a government outpost, and I remember listening to Nixon's voice over the radio. I could only just hear it because there was such heavy gunfire where I was. Absolutely, attack after attack were being launched on this government outpost. And I remember thinking right then, the ceasefire that Nixon has engineered is only a ploy to get the American soldiers out of Indo China with what President Nixon said was honour. There was no ceasefire and no peace in Indo China. Only the Americans were out.
Was it peace with honour?
I don't believe it was peace with honour even. Not for President Nixon, certainly not for the Cambodians and Vietnamese, who were engaged in a bloody war continually from then on their own.